Two lifelong friends were fishing on the Pascagoula River under the Mississippi moon when something emerged from the water that defied everything they knew about the world. What Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson experienced next would become one of the most terrifying and inexplicable alien abduction cases in American history, witnessed by a terrified outsider who never asked for the nightmare. It was October 11, 1973, a Thursday evening in the humid lowlands of Jackson County, Mississippi, where the air hung heavy with the scent of brackish water and Spanish moss draped from ancient cypress trees. Calvin Parker was 19 years old, a recent high school graduate with a slight build and quiet demeanor, working odd jobs to support his young family while dreaming of a future away from the shipyards. Charles Hickson was 42, a burly shipyard welder with a weathered face and steady hands, married with children, the kind of man who fixed problems with tools and hard work. They had been friends since childhood, bonded by growing up in the same small Mississippi town, and on this particular evening, they decided to escape the week's pressures by fishing together on the Pascagoula River, a slow-moving waterway that wound through pine forests and salt marshes toward the Gulf. The two men launched Hickson's aluminum boat around 7 o'clock, the sky still light with the fading sunset, as they motored down the river toward a familiar fishing spot near the old Corey shipyard, where the water deepened and the fish were plentiful. They cast their lines and settled in, the rhythmic lapping of water against the boat and the occasional croak of bullfrogs creating a peaceful rhythm that eased the tension from their days. As darkness fell completely around 8 o'clock, the only light came from the river's reflection of the moon and a distant dock light across the water, casting long shadows that danced on the surface. Hickson was reeling in a line when he suddenly tensed, his eyes fixed on something moving in the water ahead of their boat. At first, he thought it was a large fish, or perhaps a log drifting downstream, but as it drew closer, illuminated by the faint dock light, he realized it was no natural object. Emerging from the river about 40 feet in front of their boat was a large, oval-shaped craft, approximately 10 feet long and 8 feet wide, glowing with an intense blue light that made the water around it shimmer unnaturally. The object hovered silently above the surface, not bobbing with the current, but perfectly still, as if defying gravity and physics entirely. Parker, who had been dozing in the back of the boat, sat up and stared, his fishing rod forgotten in his lap. Neither man spoke at first, both transfixed by the impossible sight before them. The craft had no visible seams or markings, its surface smooth like polished metal, and it made no sound, no engine hum, no water disturbance beyond its initial emergence. As they watched, frozen in disbelief, a door or hatchway appeared in the side of the craft, not sliding open, but materializing as if the wall simply dissolved, revealing a rectangular opening from which an even brighter blue light poured out, so intense it hurt their eyes to look at it directly. Before either man could react, 3 bizarre figures emerged from the opening and began walking or floating toward the boat, moving in a jerky mechanical motion that suggested they were not accustomed to Earth's gravity. Hickson and Parker later described them as about 5 feet tall, with long, thin arms that ended in claw-like hands or pincers, their bodies covered in smooth gray skin that seemed almost rubbery. The most terrifying feature were their faces. No visible eyes, nose, or mouth that the men could discern. Just smooth, featureless heads with what appeared to be slits or openings where eyes should be, and a sort of antenna or protrusion on top of their heads that swayed as they moved. They wore no clothing, or if they did, it blended seamlessly with their skin. And their movements were deliberate but unnatural, like marionettes operated by invisible strings. Parker, overcome with terror, began to scream and tried to leap from the boat, but before he could, he felt a strange numbness spread through his body, starting from his feet and moving upward, paralyzing him completely while leaving his mind alert and screaming in panic. Hickson experienced the same sensation, his muscles freezing as if encased in concrete, his fishing rod slipping from his numb fingers into the water. They were conscious, but utterly helpless, unable to move or even turn their heads, reduced to prisoners in their own bodies as the three beings approached the side of their boat. The creatures reached out with their long arms and easily lifted both men from the boat, their claw-like hands gripping Parker and Hickson under the arms and carrying them through the air toward the open hatchway of the craft. The men floated weightlessly, the numbness preventing any sensation of motion or fear of falling. But their minds raced with horror at the realization of what was happening. They were being taken, abducted by something not of this world, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As they passed through the hatchway into the blinding blue light, Parker felt a wave of nausea and dread wash over him, his last conscious thought before everything went black being a desperate prayer for his wife and newborn child back home. Inside the craft, Hickson's memories were fragmented and nightmarish. He recalled being carried through a corridor of smooth, curved walls that seemed to glow from within, the air thick and metallic-tasting, pressing against his skin like a heavy fog. The beings placed him on a cold, hard surface that felt like metal, and he could sense rather than see them surrounding him, their presence oppressive and clinical, like doctors examining a specimen. He heard no words, no sounds at all, but felt a probing sensation in his mind, as if they were communicating telepathically, their thoughts cold and emotionless, assessing him, studying him, determining what to do with this unexpected human intruder into their domain. The examination that followed was invasive and terrifying. Instruments that Hickson couldn't see but could feel moving over his body, scanning him, taking samples, probing areas that made him want to scream but couldn't because of the paralysis. Time lost all meaning in that blue-lit chamber, minutes stretching into hours, or perhaps the other way around, his sense of reality completely unmoored. Parker, who had passed out during the abduction, remembered little of the interior experience, only flashes of cold light and pressure, a sense of being moved and examined before consciousness returned. The next thing either man clearly remembered was being returned to their boat, deposited roughly onto the floor as if discarded, the numbness fading just enough for them to collapse in a heap, trembling and sobbing in relief and terror. The craft was gone, vanished back into the river or up into the night sky, leaving no trace except the two broken men in their boat drifting aimlessly on the dark water. For what felt like hours but was actually only about 20 minutes of real time, Hickson and Parker sat huddled together, too traumatized to speak, their minds reeling from the impossible experience they had just survived. Hickson, the older and steadier of the two, finally gathered himself enough to start the boat's engine with shaking hands, navigating back up the river toward the dock where they had launched, every shadow and ripple now a potential threat. They beached the boat around 9 o'clock and sat on the dock in the darkness, trying to process what had happened, knowing that telling anyone would make them sound insane. After agonizing debate, they decided they had to report it, if only to protect others from whatever they had encountered. They drove to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, arriving around 9:30, both men still pale and trembling, their clothes damp from the river air and sweat. Deputy Fred Diamond listened to their halting account with growing skepticism, but the genuine terror in their voices and their physical state suggested they weren't making it up or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. He took their statements separately to check for inconsistencies, but both men gave nearly identical descriptions of the craft, the beings, and the abduction, their fear too raw to have been fabricated on the spot. Word of the incident spread quickly through the small coastal town, and within hours, investigators from the Air Force's Project Blue Book and local law enforcement were involved, recognizing that something extraordinary had been reported by two credible citizens with no apparent motive to lie. The case that unfolded would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about UFO encounters and leave a legacy of unanswered questions that echoes through UFO history to this day. The immediate aftermath was chaos for Hickson and Parker. They were subjected to extensive questioning, polygraph examinations, psychological evaluations, and medical tests, all of which showed no signs of deception, intoxication, or mental illness. Their story remained consistent under pressure, the details too specific and bizarre to have been fabricated on the spot.
The days following the abduction were a whirlwind of investigation and skepticism for Hickson and Parker, as local law enforcement, Air Force investigators, and curious townspeople tried to make sense of their impossible story. But the psychological scars and lingering questions would haunt them for decades, turning a quiet fishing trip into one of the most enduring UFO mysteries. When Hickson and Parker arrived at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office shortly after 9 o'clock that evening, the small coastal station was quiet, the night shift consisting of a few deputies handling routine calls. Deputy Fred Diamond, a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, was the first to take their statements, noting immediately the men's physical state. Pale, sweating, trembling uncontrollably, their eyes wide with genuine fear that no amount of acting could replicate. He separated them into different rooms to prevent collusion, a standard procedure for witness statements, and began with Hickson, the older man who seemed more composed despite the ordeal. Under questioning, Hickson described the craft's emergence from the water, the being's appearance, the paralysis, and the abduction in precise detail, his voice steady but his hands still shaking as he gripped the arms of the interview chair. Diamond took extensive notes, probing for inconsistencies or signs of intoxication, but Hickson was sober, coherent, and unwavering, even when pressed about the being's appearance, which he described as like robots or something from another world. When Parker was questioned separately, his account matched Hickson's almost perfectly, a 19-year-old's voice breaking with emotion as he recounted the terror of being lifted helpless into the light, his youth making his fear even more poignant. Diamond, a veteran who had seen his share of wild stories from fishermen and drunks, found himself believing them despite the absurdity, their sincerity too raw to dismiss. By 10 o'clock, word had spread through the station, and Sheriff Fred Ware was called in, along with additional deputies to assist with the investigation. Ware, a pragmatic man from the small town south, initially suspected the men had been drinking or using drugs, but breath tests and sobriety checks came back clean, and their behavior didn't match substance abuse. No slurred speech, no erratic movements, just profound shock and trauma. The sheriff authorized a search of the river area where the men claimed the abduction occurred, dispatching patrol boats and officers with spotlights to scan the water and shoreline for any evidence of the craft or the men's story. They found nothing, no debris, no burn marks, no unusual readings, just the ordinary flow of the Pascagoula River under the October moon. As the story leaked to local radio stations around midnight, the media frenzy began, with reporters from Jackson, New Orleans, and even national outlets converging on Gautier and Pascagoula, turning the quiet fishing spot into a circus of camera crews and curious onlookers. Hickson and Parker were thrust into the spotlight they never wanted, subjected to endless interviews where they repeated their story with the same consistency, their fear gradually giving way to a resolute determination to be believed. Skeptics in the media portrayed them as hoaxers or attention seekers, but those who met them personally, reporters, investigators, even passers-by, noted the men's quiet dignity and lack of embellishment, their accounts never changing under pressure or the promise of fame and money. The Air Force's Project Blue Book, the official military program investigating UFO reports, took interest in the case due to its proximity to military installations and the multiple elements that couldn't be easily dismissed: 2 credible witnesses, a specific location, and a sighting that involved physical contact rather than just a light in the sky. Investigators from Keesler Air Force Base arrived the next day, October 12th, led by Lieutenant Commander Gary Perkins and a team of specialists who conducted formal interviews, administered polygraph tests, and examined the abduction site thoroughly. The polygraphs, administered by experienced examiners, showed no deception from either man, their physiological responses indicating they were telling the truth as they remembered it, a result that puzzled the military team accustomed to debunking most UFO reports as misidentifications or hoaxes. Physical examinations at a local hospital revealed elevated stress hormones and minor abrasions consistent with being handled roughly, but no unusual marks, implants, or radiation exposure that some abduction cases later reported. Blood and urine tests came back normal, ruling out drugs or toxins, and psychological evaluations by a Navy psychiatrist found both men mentally stable, with no history of hallucinations or mental illness, though both exhibited acute stress disorder from the trauma.
The Blue Book team classified the case as unidentified, one of only about 5% of reports that couldn't be explained by conventional means, and their internal memos expressed genuine bafflement at the consistency of the witnesses and the lack of a rational alternative. If you're captivated by the terrifying details of the Pascagoula abduction so far, please subscribe to America's UFO Legacy, because we dive deep into these classic cases every week, uncovering the evidence, investigations, and lasting impact on the witnesses. And your support helps us continue preserving these crucial pieces of unexplained American history that deserve to be told. The investigation expanded beyond the military, drawing in civilian UFO researchers like J. Allen Hynek, the renowned astronomer and scientific consultant to Project Blue Book, who traveled to Mississippi to interview Hickson and Parker personally. Hynek, who had spent years debunking UFO sightings as swamp gas or weather phenomena, found the Pascagoula case particularly compelling due to the witnesses' credibility and the physical paralysis they described, which matched other abduction reports he had studied. He noted the men's lack of motive, neither sought fame or money, and in fact, the experience cost them jobs, relationships, and social standing in their conservative Southern community. Hynek's report to the Air Force recommended further study of abduction phenomenon, arguing that cases like Pascagoula suggested something anomalous was occurring that science couldn't yet explain, a position that put him at odds with more skeptical colleagues, but established him as a pioneer in serious UFO research. Local law enforcement continued their own investigation, interviewing potential witnesses in the area and checking for any reports of strange lights or sounds that night. A security guard at the nearby paper mill, Johnny Mac Gordon, came forward with a corroborating account that strengthened the case significantly. Gordon, a no-nonsense night watchman with no connection to Hickson or Parker, reported seeing a large, glowing object hovering over the river around the same time as the abduction, approximately 8 o'clock. He described it as oval-shaped with intense blue light, moving erratically before shooting away at high speed, an account he gave independently before hearing the fisherman's story, adding a crucial third witness to an event that otherwise relied on 2 traumatized individuals. Gordon's sighting, documented in police reports and later verified under questioning, made outright dismissal of the case much more difficult, as it suggested something unusual was indeed in the area that night. The psychological impact on Hickson and Parker was profound and immediate. Parker, the younger man, suffered panic attacks and nightmares for years, his once promising life derailed by the trauma. He moved away from Mississippi, struggled with relationships, and rarely spoke publicly about the incident, preferring to fade into obscurity. Hickson, more resilient but deeply affected, experienced recurring visions of the beings and a sense of being watched, though he became the public face of the case, giving interviews and testifying before congressional hearings on UFOs in the late 1970s. Both men underwent hypnotic regression sessions with researchers, attempting to recover suppressed memories, but the results were mixed. Fragmented images of examinations and telepathic communication that added detail but no definitive proof, and the hypnosis itself was criticized for potentially creating false memories. The Pascagoula case ignited national and international interest, featured in newspapers, magazines, and television programs that both sensationalized and scrutinized the story. It became a touchstone for the abduction phenomenon, influencing later reports with its description of the gray-skinned, featureless beings and the paralysis effect, though skeptics argued this was cultural contamination from media exposure rather than independent corroboration. Proposed explanations ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary. Some claimed the men had encountered a secret military craft testing anti-gravity technology. Others suggested a shared hallucination induced by swamp gas or electromagnetic fields from the river. Still others proposed an elaborate hoax using a rented boat and costume that somehow fooled investigators. But none adequately explained the third witness, the polygraph results, or the men's lifelong consistency. The U.S. government took official notice when the case was discussed in congressional hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena, with Hickson testifying before lawmakers about the need for serious investigation rather than ridicule. His dignified appearance and straightforward account impressed some legislators, leading to calls for renewed UFO research funding, though the momentum faded with changing political priorities. Project Blue Book officially closed in 1969, but Pascagoula occurred afterward, falling under ad hoc military investigations that produced classified reports, later partially declassified, revealing internal debates about the case's authenticity and implications for national security. The legacy of the Pascagoula abduction endures as one of the cleanest, most credible close encounter cases, with no apparent motive for deception, multiple witnesses, and extensive documentation that withstand scrutiny. Hickson passed away in 2011 at age 80, maintaining until his final days that what happened on that October night was real and terrifying, a brush with something beyond human comprehension that he never fully understood but always respected. Parker, who outlived his friend, has spoken less publicly but reaffirmed the story in later years, his voice carrying the weight of decades-lived trauma. The quiet fishing spot on the Pascagoula River has become a pilgrimage site for UFO enthusiasts, marked by a plaque commemorating the incident, a reminder that extraordinary events can happen to ordinary people in the most mundane settings. The investigation continues to divide opinion. Believers see it as proof of extraterrestrial visitation and human interest from advanced beings. Skeptics view it as a psychological phenomenon amplified by cultural expectations of the 1970s UFO craze, while researchers maintain it deserves ongoing study as part of a larger pattern of abduction experiences worldwide. What truly happened to Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker on that moonlit river remains one of ufology's greatest unsolved mysteries, a story that challenges our understanding of reality and invites us to consider the possibility that we are not alone and that contact may already have occurred in ways we can scarcely imagine. Before we conclude this chilling account of the Pascagoula abduction, I want to hear your perspective. Do you believe Hickson and Parker encountered genuine extraterrestrial beings, or is there a more earthly explanation for their terrifying experience? Could two ordinary fishermen maintain such a consistent, detailed story for decades if it wasn't true? Or did something psychological or cultural shape their memories? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because exploring these profound cases together helps us all grapple with the unknown, and I read every comment to better understand how people interpret these life-changing encounters. The Pascagoula incident stands as a cornerstone of UFO research, demonstrating that abduction experiences aren't limited to solitary individuals in remote areas, but can happen to friends fishing on familiar waters, witnessed by outsiders who corroborate key elements. It raised uncomfortable questions about human vulnerability to unknown forces, the limitations of memory and perception under extreme stress, and the government's role in investigating phenomena that blur the line between science fiction and potential reality. As declassified documents continue to emerge and new witnesses come forward with similar accounts, the case reminds us that the truth about what Hickson and Parker experienced that night may still be waiting to be fully revealed, hidden in the dark waters of the Pascagoula River or among the stars above.